Welcome to the Institute Speaks, a podcast from the Institute of Public Scholarship where the humanities, arts, and sciences converge. Here, we'll have conversations about what we do, why we do it, and what it all means. Together, we'll explore the implications for us, our communities, and for the world we have the audacity to envision. I'm Jessica Ivey, the director and program lead of Sounds of Our Stories at the Institute. I'll be your host. This is the Institute Speaks. Hello, Dr. Johnson.
Hello, Scholar Ivey.
How are you today?
I am fabulous today.
Yeah, you are.
Thank you.
It's really, really good to see you and to finally have this conversation on the mic.
I know, right?
Okay.
We've had it in plenty other places as I've been on a tirade, but
Yeah,
thanks for
that's
miking
one
the
too.
tirade.
Yeah. It's time. I think people really deserve to know the truth behind this phenomenon that we've turned it into. I think when I go back to the quarantine, America's in its listen and learn era, and like, oh, this thing has happened and we really need to just listen to people of color. And like this oversensitive, like pity meets action,
Mhm.
right? So I've seen like stickers instead of thoughts and prayers. We want to see like policy and action,
And
and,
action.
and
And
I'm
some money.
with and some money, some
Mhm.
capital, right? Like I'm
Mhm.
with that, but I feel like the residuals of what seemed like to white people a shock in the murder of George Floyd, and when all of the shutdown happened, where all people are doing is scrolling. I think Juneteenth as a holiday, as a phenomenon, as a thing to celebrate and to just spotlight became um like a carrot to dangle for black folk,
Mhm.
of like, we're not gonna do anything, but we'll give you Juneteenth off. We're not really gonna make any sustainable changes, but we'll acknowledge it as a national holiday and we'll sell t-shirts for you to buy. Right? Like
At Target until we won't anymore.
until they're
Right?
gone. So I think the way that it's been presented is now this like pseudo conscious gold star for black folks and everyone else, right? People that consider themselves to be allies or conscious are like, oh yeah, because Juneteenth this year we got to celebrate it for real, but no real analysis or critical thought around the state of our world before 2020 or beyond a post, right? Are we really reading? Are we really dissecting information? Are we really divesting and investing according to our values? And so I think Juneteenth has become a really comfortable place for people to just kind of shrug off and be like, see, look, I'm doing the work.
Mhm.
All the while getting the history wrong.
Way wrong.
So I would like to hear your thoughts on sort of the rise and popularization of Juneteenth.
Okay. Well, so I want to go back to Lula Briggs Galloway's work, who was a activist and cultural producer in Saginaw, who was really the first person that I learned about Juneteenth from. And from what I recall, she was from Texas, so it had some kind of resonance for her, right? Because it is a real historic moment.
Mm-hmm.
But the context that got wrapped around Juneteenth is like highly inaccurate.
Mm.
And so what happens is like, so around the 90s is we start to see this resurgence in this kind of national discourse that's spreading from Texas across the country about Juneteenth. Around the same time when we've got the second the second BAM, the second Black Action movements happening. We have this resurgence of radicalness and nationalism that's emerging in hip hop and popular culture. Living single, there was a
Yeah.
strong emphasis there. So in the 90s, we're like, kind of circling back after a really dull 1980s, in so many
Yeah.
ways. I won't go into all the ways, but
Another time.
so right, so there's this resurgence of a Black pride. We see it like in Boogie Down Productions. We see it in a bunch of different folks. And so then this was like part of that,
Okay.
when we started to, Kwanzaa starts really kind of hitting around that time too, late 80s, early 90s. And so there's this move for us to like center ourselves in some sense of Black pride. The problem is that the narrative that was emerging about Juneteenth, and this is, where I get really heated about it, is that, the Civil War had ended and Black people and enslaved people in Texas didn't know, right? We just didn't know that we were free, and it took the Union forces to come in to tell us that we were free because we just didn't know, right?
Aloof.
And right, exactly. And so for me, this is fundamentally problematic. One, because we had already had troops, we'd already had Union troops in Texas for well over a year by this time. We had Black men enlisting in the war for, let's see, 2-3 years, or trying to for 2 or 3 years,
right,
at that point. And we also had a long-standing network of Black people who knew what was happening with each other, right? There's all kinds of documentation for the ways that we had people on plantations that were communicating across states, right? Not just from this plantation to the other plantation, but we had established over, that 200 years plus, ways to communicate. And some of them were newspapers, right? Some of them were publications. They weren't just, it wasn't always just word of mouth.
Right.
And so the idea that somehow that we were insulated and ignorant about our own freedom and about the freedom of others, for me, is the ultimate insult for Juneteenth, because it just discounts the networks that we had built and cultivated. And it situates us as ignorant, right? And so then, I get so heated about it because then that becomes the national holiday.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's like based
the day
on
we told you.
based on ignorance, not the fact that the way that the Civil War ended ultimately in Texas is because hundreds and hundreds of Black men came to shut that war down, to be able to ensure that that didn't rise again, and then stayed sometimes for 6 months to a year afterward to make sure that Confederacy, that sense of white supremacy, we call the white absurdity, didn't emerge again, right? Or in the ways that it had. And so, yes, there was, a proclamation in June, on June 19th. But the proclamation had already been happening in our hearts. That proclamation had already been happening in our behavior as men coming from Indiana and Illinois and the East Coast are coming into Texas to close this war out. So, yes, that was a historic moment, but it wasn't contingent on our lack of knowledge, and it certainly wasn't contingent on the fact that we had been invested and we were fighting this war very much in that same place.
Right.
And so for me, when Juneteenth became a holiday, I was like, of course it did, right? Because we couldn't celebrate what I think is perhaps, and this isn't to discount. So when we look at Juneteenth through the lens of the hundreds of Black men who closed that war out,
that is worth celebrating.
Exactly. When we look at like Lewis Anderson, George Bandy, Eli Jones, Alexander Gulliver, James T. Roberts, and so many other people for which we have now pension records. Denise Miller and I went to D.C. and gathered these pension records of the men who were coming, especially out of Indiana, and going into Texas to close this war out.
Wow.
Incredible stories. We still even haven't gotten through all of them. We brought back, I think, 60 pension records of folks.
Wow.
That's the story right there. That's the Juneteenth story.
People
and that's just a little minuscule part of that's we're looking at one troop that went in, and there were multiple troops that were going in before that and during and after that. And so that's the beautiful Juneteenth story. And I never really thought about myself as a military historian because but this is the place where I am committed to being a military historian, to being able to tell these stories of men who are choosing to fight in the war because they not only want their own freedom, but they're invested in the freedom of other people. I'm interested in telling the stories of the people who are coming into Texas, and they don't want to keep fighting, right? But they're committed to doing that. They're facing disease. They're facing what when you lose your teeth.
What what's that called?
What is right? Like not scurvy, but something like it, right? So they're from a lack of vitamin C.
Yeah.
So they're facing these kinds
There's a
of
name for that? Oh
yeah.
my god.
There is. I don't think it's scurvy, but sorry, people.
Yeah, Google it.
Right. I'm not a medical historian. That's why we have Dr. Cheryl Dixon with us on
That's
this
right.
project
That's right.
to be able to help identify some of this. And so, they're not really wanting to, but they still are doing it because of the need for freedom
Value.
for themselves and their community. And for me, that's the story. Like, what were the conditions under which these men were working and fighting? What were they? What were the conditions that they were facing when they were an occupying force?
Right.
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 In a rabidly racist state. Right. And so they're still staying. So to me, that is the Juneteenth story, really. Yep. And then emerging out of that, also the ways that Black people were in Texas, very localized, were continuing to celebrate emancipation as they were understanding it, as it had come to Texas.
Right.
Texas is really like the last frontier, so to speak, for that wave of freedom. And so as Black people are then creating these emancipation celebrations, right, across the state of Texas, as Black people are solidifying their relationships with Black-centered communities, and when they're creating these celebrations, they're taking over space, they're taking over parks, they're creating a bigger footprint for themselves in Texas. That's important and that's significant. But what it doesn't do is look at the history of emancipation celebrations in this country prior to that. Is 1839 in Detroit. We are already starting to celebrate emancipation for those folks in the British Islands, right? And so in 1839 in Detroit and other places, particularly in the East Coast, we are saying, oh, those Black Brits are free. Let's celebrate that.
Yeah.
The folks in Haiti are free. Let's celebrate that. We know who's free, and there's not this sense of ignorance, but this very intense sense of awareness of where we all are in the world, right? We have a diasporic perspective, which is very different from the idea that, I didn't know from one state to the next that I was supposed to be free.
If I knew the Black Brits were free.
Right, exactly. If I knew the Haitians were free.
Yeah, that's good.
And so it's that context that gets me kind of really riled up around this issue, because 1839 all up through the 1850s and even after 1894 here in Kalamazoo, we have an emancipation celebration where people articulate why are we having an emancipation celebration on August 1st, and it circles back to the August 1st emancipation of the Brits, right, of Black enslaved people in the British Islands. And so what we're doing is, people are coming every summer. Now it starts to then switch. Once slavery ends, then we, in this country, ends theoretically. So we start to have it January 1st and August 1st. And sometimes we have it both times. Okay. People are still consistently landing on August because, well, that's, like as they say here in Kalamazoo, it's just a better time to have an outdoor party.
Yes.
January not the exact words, tough. But, that it works well, but it also is connected to this diasporic history.
Yes.
And so then those emancipation celebrations are ones that gather people from, like in Saginaw, people come from Detroit, they come from Kalamazoo, to be able to participate, as Frederick Douglass comes in on the train and goes and stays with William Atwood, a very wealthy Black man and lumberer in Saginaw. And these all are part of a network, right? Yes. William Atwood knows Frederick Douglass, knows William Lambert in Detroit, coming back to the fact that we know who each other are. We know each other. And we are celebrating, and not just celebrating this freedom, this nebulous freedom at that, but we are strategizing about the future. We're addressing the present, and we're thinking about how are we going to move forward, right? we're celebrating, we start celebrating the progress, right? But we also simultaneously are saying, we still need to be able to vote,
Yep, we
right?
got somewhere to go.
There's still an enormous amount of progress that still needs to happen, and that legal freedom is not the ticket, right?
Yes.
It's not the only ticket. We got a whole list of tickets we got to accumulate before we have true emancipation. And so that leads me to talking about the Lincoln Jubilee in 1915. So when 1915 comes along, we've got, from 1839 to 1915, let's see, do the math, that's 75 years.
Wow.
Right? Is that right? No. Yeah, 75 years.
I'm a musician. I don't know about the math.
Of people celebrating the emancipation of Black people in the diaspora. But in 1915, August 1st, we start celebrating the Lincoln Jubilee in Chicago. But prior to that, as early as January of that same year of 1915, Governor Ferris, who our governor was at this time, set up a team of people from across the state of Michigan to go out and gather data about what the status was for Black people across the state, but also as a part of a larger trajectory to the Lincoln Jubilee, also want to know what's happening with Black people in the Black diaspora, right? So here we have a team of people like Oscar Baker, Lulu Williams, Jacob Johnson's great-grandmother, a whole host of people. Elijah McCoy's wife, I think Marie McCoy, don't quote me on that. A whole host of people that are going out and gathering qualitative and quantitative data to identify what is the status of Black people now, at this point, 50 years after emancipation.
Right.
And so they're casting this net really wide, doing interviews with people, gathering biographical information, statistics on how people are dying, property ownership.
Looking at those patterns.
Right, exactly. To be able to contribute to the 1915 Lincoln Jubilee in Chicago that takes place for a month, in August and September. And
there that is again.
But what the Lincoln Jubilee does, the people the people kind of organizing this larger gathering of folks, and we have people come, I think 18 different locations across the country that are coming there, but they're also reaching out to people in the Netherlands, in Turkey, in France, all over the world. Every place they can find Black people, they're reaching out and saying, so what are your conditions like there in these other countries? So this to me indicates, like, still in 1915, we're not just thinking about one state. We're categorically handling what's happening in Michigan, and pull together an amazing document in the course of 6 months. But we're saying that the net needs to be cast wide. In order for us to really identify what's happening for us as emancipated Black people, we need to look in all of these other countries.
Yes.
And so
wherever we find ourselves.
Exactly.
The global perspective.
Then when we come back to an idea that somehow we just didn't know we were free, it just flies in the face of fact, right? It flies in the face of the idea that we know that we're out there and we want to know what's happening with each other. And so that to me is a far more, I'm not going to say more interesting, and I would have said that until I started really digging into these men who fought in Texas.
Right.
But it's a more comprehensive story.
And accurate.
Yeah.
Factual.
And they could, so it's, and rather than even saying one is more, the less, the other is less, it's when we put them all together, we have a story, a narrative of our autonomy, of our authenticity, of our interconnectedness, of our understanding about our global experience on the planet, and a sense of network and community, right? And so that's an empowered Black people.
That's right.
And so that's why,
not an aloof one.
Right, exactly. So so Juneteenth has to weave in that story and say it's just one of the stories. Memorial Day was started by Black people.
Yeah.
Right? As people
they don't want that one.
right, exactly. And that was like the first emancipation celebration.
That's right.
Thousands of people showing up for that.
Mm.
And so we have to keep pushing to not let this sanitized version, almost of like what they did with Martin Luther, or what they continue to do with Martin Luther King. I saw a flyer last year of Martin Luther King like turned up, like he was at a party for Martin Luther King Day, and that they were having an event based on that kind of image. He would turn over in his grave if that's the way his legacy was being represented. We cannot let it become sanitized. We can't let it become a false narrative of who we are and how we are. And yeah, so my shoulders are tense right now.
Roll them back,
right.
Get your wellness.
And so like I really welcome being able to have these kinds of conversations. To get the word out to people. Don't fall for the okie doke. Because we're so much more than the way that Juneteenth is being represented. And are they going to celebrate a military victory for Black people that happened only because Black people were there? That's the real Juneteenth story.
That's what happened.
For Juneteenth, and there lots of things happening before that, lots of things happening after that. But I don't think they want to think about us with a bunch of guns and in the war.
No, it does not behoove them. Aloof does though. And aloof Black people from now all the way till then, absolutely.
Right, and ignorant Black people, which as long as we accept that story, then we continue to be the Black people that they say we are. Right? If we keep saying, "Oh, we didn't know," then we got plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise.
Yeah.
And so we're just playing, we're playing into that hand that seeks to subjugate us with an ignorance of our history.
That's so good. Even as you're talking about that, I hear, I know you said you're not a medical historian or, a war historian, but I hear your focus on resistance and insistence and how you come to this conversation with that lens. So just tell me more how you came to that. I mean, I know your story a bit, but for anyone listening, how you come to the stories and narrative of resistance and insistence to slavery, to oppression, and how that sort of combats in this conversation as we're talking about aloof versus empowered, how resisting against a thing, being insistent on what you will and will not do compared to being resilient, right? Where we think about, oh, well, Black people were just so resilient. And the implications.
That's how we survived.
Right? The implications of that narrative, especially in comparison to what it has meant for us historically and presently to resist and insist. If you could kind of talk about that juxtaposition and how you got to that narrative in your own work.
Absolutely. I would love to. Well, go way back. The reason I even went to grad school was to study the role of resistance, and particularly the role of Black retained traditions and religions in resistant movements. As an undergrad, my last year, next to my last semester, my professor, Dr. Linda Susan Beard, showed us a video about Maroon societies, particularly in Brazil. And I was like, wait,
yeah.
Wait a minute.
I know that set you on fire.
You know it sure did. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Because I grew up independently reading Frederick Douglass.
So I
knew about resistance. I read my little junior scholastic version of Frederick Douglass's life.
Yes.
And closely identified. I had refused to. By third grade, I refused to sing the national anthem or put my hand over my heart. So it's in me. And so I knew these little pieces, but I was a senior in college before I found out that people had escaped, had resisted, had insisted on retaining their West African traditions and gone off someplace else and be like, we don't need y'all. Now, not without contestation, for
of course,
sure.
Of course.
And so it was that, that awareness of maroon societies, and that learning that, oh, it wasn't just Brazil. It was
Mm-hmm.
every place we were enslaved. It was Mexico, it was Cuba, it was Jamaica, it was Puerto Rico, it was
Mm-hmm.
Louisiana, it was Florida, it
Mm.
was the Sea Islands. Everywhere that we had been enslaved, we had fought back from the beginning.
Mm.
Um, and so that's what brought me back to grad school, and then starting to study, some of the more intricate details of
Mm.
what resistance looked like. And for me, it came to having control over and asserting control over space, place, and nature.
Mm.
Yeah, that was my lens for it. And so at the time, this an anti shout out to one of my graduate advisors at Michigan when I was there. At the time during grad school, I was like, I really want to study the Underground Railroad. I'd heard like inklings of George de Baptiste
Yep.
and
Yep.
William Lambert, and I was like, there's a story here.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, oh, they overemphasize that. That's not really a thing to focus on. We don't know if any of that's
Mm.
true. And
Is that not what research is for? Like reading and
Mhm.
looking into? I don't know. I
And
just.
so, quite frankly, I caved. I
Yep.
caved at that point because at that she knew I thought more than I knew.
Mm.
And so I just let it sit. Focused. I went, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida. I focused on other areas, and so went away. Had my first job at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Just really wanted to come back to Michigan for a lot of, mostly academic reasons and career reasons, and I got hooked up as being the Freedom Trail coordinator for the state of Michigan, and I went loose.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, Detroit was one of the first places that I started. Detroit and Cass County and Calhoun County. And then just the evidence just starts emerging, right?
Immediately.
In newspapers, in oral testimonies, in archaeological
Mm-hmm.
surveys like we
Primary,
did in
secondary
Cass
sources.
County,
Just. Yep.
exactly. And, I was very excited, but the resentment for this professor
Mm.
just really continued to grow. And so as I gathered, stacks and stacks of primary sources that refuted what she had said, that that was a fuel for me. That was that
Mm.
insistence.
Yep.
That insistence of what I knew in my gut. And then what the documentary evidence provided. And so,
I gotta pause there for an aside though, because I think the people that advise us, the professors, the mentors, the coworkers, I think it's such a key role in our confidence as we grow of scholars, and what we're doing here at the Institute is very much derivative of what I think you have provided for people all across our staff, all across this community, that sense of trustworthiness and safety and belief, right? It's empowering inherently that I see where you're going and let me push you towards that, and you go see what you find, rather than I don't know about that. Why don't you do this, and moving on, right? And so that's another thread that just popped up for me hearing you talk about that and comparing to how our relationship began when I was really in a reckoning of my own sort of undergrad experience, and you facilitated a style of teaching and learning and wind beneath the wings of no, there's something there, go and seek it out, not just here's the answer, or right,
yes.
like you really teeing it up did not look like even a handout. It really looked like support offsite, and by looking and providing what resources you did have here, maybe connected to that. If you do this assignment about this, what might that bring up for you? I think you really were masterful in the way that you have facilitated the dormant interests that people had academically and otherwise, and use whatever curriculum you were given um, to help push that out, to help birth that in all of us. And so I just want to publicly say thank you for that. That was so cool. And I of course that lady or whoever it was, but very
I know I haven't
interesting.
named her publicly
You
yet.
don't
She
need
know
to.
who she
She know.
is.
You know where you at. But yeah, that was not our experience, and so even in spite of that, I think the way we have been brought up as scholars and as students and lifelong learners is in part because of what you experienced in that. So I just had to pull that out while you were talking because whoa.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Because I do believe that, especially as Black scholars, whether they're undergraduate, graduate students, or like, we come from an experience, and we come from a place that has intellectual intuition
Mm,
that people try to dismiss all the time.
right.
Right. And I think that it's fundamentally important for us to explore that, to still do all the work,
Yep.
to do the research,
Because
to
it's gonna
get in
take
the
some work.
archives, exactly, still do that work, and then tease out if there was something to that intuition.
Mm,
And I would argue, like 8 times out of 10, there is something to that.
yep. And if not, you're gonna find something else.
Exactly. And so as I'm on that journey with looking at all this documentary evidence,
Mm.
going up against, teachers and school systems that still were doing, the quilt curriculum for the Underground Railroad that turned out to have, that happened in one geographic location.
We love making
Now,
stuff up and taking it
white
and
people,
running.
it was a white woman who wrote that book that
Wow.
then, it went across the country like wildfire.
Mm,
And I understood, and I spent a lot of time talking about why that had happened,
mm,
right? Because people had a hard time seeing women in places of resistance.
Right.
You had to be Harriet Tubman to resist, and people didn't always, because a lot of our attraction to history is often like associative. Like, if I
Mm,
was there, what would I do?
Yep.
How
That's
how can
good.
I see myself in these narratives?
Sure.
And probably a lot of women couldn't see themselves, wielding a gun,
That seemed like a bit much.
right. And so the idea that we could still resist from the sphere of domesticity, right, was
Mm,
appealing to people.
I believe that.
We could do it from our kitchen table.
Mm-hmm.
We could
Mm-hmm.
throw a quilt over the fence and be part of the resistance.
Yeah.
It's a nice idea,
Yep.
but people were building whole curriculums on the Underground Railroad based on this
Yep.
idea.
Yep.
So I peed off a lot of people. I was not popular for a couple of years. But then what I started doing is then providing the evidence of
Yep.
women, fighting back, of women boycotting, of women engaging, hosting people in their homes.
Because there's that same thread of domesticity, but with the historical evidence to back it up.
Yep, and we got people like Elizabeth Casey that's going to, is fighting, is like, knocking
Yeah.
people out in the cornfield.
Right.
We have Nancy in Battle Creek who's like, if this man comes up here, I've got this hot shovel. And if he come up here, I'm putting this
gonna find out.
up through his core.
Okay.
Right. Yes, that's from the sphere of domesticity, but it's a little bit of a different angle on
That's
it.
right.
Right.
That's right.
And so, once I started, and with teams of people across the state, providing the evidence, which was so much more interesting than the quilts were really, then people started saying, oh, okay, I can see my community in this story. I can see particular people. I can see particular places. And so it was that, like correcting the narrative when people didn't want to be corrected. That
stepping on toes now.
Right. That I got a thicker skin about it. Talking to people about, enslaved versus slaves, I just kept pushing for a more accurate representation. And so I was a Freedom Trail coordinator for something like 7 or 8 years, something like that, with the state of Michigan. And so more and more information started to emerge. Took a little break from that, and then to run a nonprofit and to have a nonprofit run me for a little bit. And then I was asked to come back to the state and do some work on Black history from 1865 up to 1915.
Okay.
And so that's when I started to dig a little bit more into this military history. You had to, because it was the same thread of resistance, right? Not just like a a theoretical or even a historical thread, but actually the same people. George the Baptist in Detroit,
Yep.
who was, resisting slavery in all kinds of ways, from, speeches to hiding people to
Yep.
assisting people in getting to Canada. By some accounts, going down and burning white churches. We don't know that yet, but some people have
It's at
suggested
least been
that.
said. Yep.
I haven't seen that evidence. But then he starts becoming a recruiter for the Massachusetts troop of colored folks. And so he takes that resistance and transforms it into, okay, so this, sorry to say it, but this is what it's come to. Frederick Douglass, who's like, before that, there are all these other ways to resist, is like, ultimately, I don't see another way.
We gotta go and fight for it.
And so I'm even advocating for my son going into the Civil War and
Wow.
fighting for fighting in this war of rebellion.
Yep.
So you see these Black people who have been resisting when the war starts, immediately, like, saying, I want to be a part of it. So we got people in Battle Creek who try to come forward. William Atwood goes back to Ohio and tries to gather the people in Ohio where he's from, and they turn him down in Ohio. They turn down folks here in Michigan who are trying to raise troops, or saying, look, we ready, right? We've got George, I can't remember George's last name, out of Battle Creek, where he says, I've got sharpshooters ready, I've got Native American and Black people ready to go. We'll go ahead and let a white man lead us, but we are ready to do this.
Yep.
And Michigan and Ohio are like, no, not yet. No.
We got to figure out where we gonna land on this thing.
Right, exactly. George the Baptist and the colored citizens of Detroit, they bring together people as soon as war breaks out, saying, we ready.
Yeah.
Right, and it takes them 2 years and a lot of heavy loss before they decide, okay.
Y'all right.
Now Massachusetts was ahead of the game. Other places were ahead of the game, but we were very slow to do that.
But the people were.
The people were ready. They were ready. And then, interesting, like once the Michigan especially says, okay, then Black folks are like, well,
kind of took a little minute there.
Right, exactly.
I'm
now
not
we got
sure.
these jobs that these white people are out that you let go out in the fight. So they had to do some heavy recruiting at that point, and they did a lot with bands. They had like this really bomb-ass band that they would go out and like go around to different places and get people all hyped up.
Okay.
But George the Baptist then recruited for Michigan as well. And so I started to see that thread. I started to see documents of folks who were saying, it's my duty to go and fight in this war. And so then I started to see that thread of the people, right, shifting and growing with their activism and understanding for them at that time that this stuff wasn't going to end if we didn't do it this way.
Yeah.
Right. And so it started to be the same people, started to be the same networks, started, these people.
Because they're established by that point.
Oh, absolutely.
Well
and
established.
It became even more clear when we started looking at pension records for people here in Michigan, when some of these activists that, like Carolyn French is coming to provide a deposition for somebody she knows, and you start seeing the interconnectedness, and so that people are enlisting in the War of the Rebellion, like with each other. They're enlisting with people that they've been knowing from, for years.
Right.
They're enlisting with people that are from the same communities that they escaped from, right? So then the Civil War, the War of the Rebellion, as it was called then, becomes this extension of that resistance and that insistence on manhood in a lot of cases for people, and this insistence on freedom and our ability and our willingness to take the risk and fight for it. So that's how I started coming to it and started looking at these pension records. And all along now, Juneteenth is getting hotter and hotter all the time, and I'm getting hotter and hotter with it. So started looking at these pension records. And then as I kept getting asked to do this Juneteenth talk and this Juneteenth talk, I'm like, are you sure?
You want me?
You sure?
Have you?
Okay.
I don't. Okay. If you're positive, I'll be there. But I'm gonna talk about the truth now.
Exactly. And so then in that time period working for the state the second time, I became aware again of the Michigan Manual for Freedmen's Progress. That
Mm,
was this compilation of all this data that Black folks had gathered under Governor Ferris to prepare for the 1915 Lincoln Jubilee.
mhm,
And so then I started really putting those pieces together and seeing the interconnectedness to the people who were putting that together and where they came from, and um, that what we were really celebrating is this military story. And
mm.
so that's when I started really saying, okay, this emancipation story is a much deeper, much
Yep.
longer story. And realizing that in order for me to fully tell that story, to more fully tell that story, I needed to dig into these men's lives, the people who actually went there.
Yep.
And so I was talking theoretically for some years about, as I started to understand more about what was happening in Texas. But now, June 13th or 14th this month, in partnership with WMed and Dr. Cheryl Dixon, who's one of our board members, and
Mhm.
Denise, we will be highlighting the stories of these men,
Mm.
based on their pension records,
Wow.
and just getting right down into it. So I'm real excited about that,
Yeah.
because for me, that's where the juice is.
Mhm.
Um, and and it's just the beginning. We've got just a little slice.
Yeah. Yeah.
We just got 60 men. It was a whole lot more than 60 men that
Believe
did
that.
that. But we can start to be, and we already are seeing, so and so, knew somebody else
Yep.
when they,
That
before they
network.
enlisted. And that's what the pension records are really profound for, is because these men and then their wives have to prove, one, that
Fought.
they fought, that their injury happened in the Civil
Mhm.
War. They have to have people come in and corroborate their claims to say,
Mhm.
yes, I knew him before he went in the Civil War. I knew him then.
Because
I've known
again, what
him.
can we do
I've
to get around paying what we owe?
And I've
Yeah.
seen him, once a week for the last 10 years. I know his wife. I know
Mm.
they got married. And so the documents are incredibly, I say this oftentimes, bittersweet, because
Mm.
these men and women are trying to prove, right, what they did and what their relationship is to this war of rebellion. But in so doing, we get to see the interconnectedness, that we've been
Mhm.
talking about, that these folks know each other. They're willing to come from Battle Creek to Detroit to give a deposition for
Yep.
somebody,
Yep.
right? They are willing to go into a situation where they're providing federal documentation,
Mm.
because they know each other and they've
Yep.
built this relationship. And so it comes, and so again, people are all interconnected, right?
Yes.
We know each
Yes.
other. We're coming to bat for each other. And again, it's not like, oh, we didn't
We just
know.
didn't
We
know.
just didn't know. No, we've got a
Not so.
history of knowing,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
sounds like a
Yeah.
good name of a book, a
History and
history of
all.
knowing.
That's good.
Yeah.
Write it down.
Yeah.
Copyright
Let
it
me write it
before
down.
we release this. Okay.
One of those
By the time you
entrepreneurs.
all hear this, it's already been taken care of. So don't even try it. We love you. It's tied up now. That's good, Doc.
I like that.
Okay. Well, the last thing I want to ask you before we get done today is about arriving to the work of the institute on the scholarship side. And so, how your journey as a scholar, looking particularly at resistance to slavery, the Underground Railroad, Michigan resistance, and connecting that to this history of knowing, this history of fighting back, the history of insisting on our human nature and not succumbing to what has been impressed upon us in order to subjugate or to profit or anything else heinous though it may be. um Acknowledging and fighting back against that, how does the work of the institute sort of culminate that work? And you can talk about in practical ways in terms of what we're doing, but even just the philosophy of continuing your work through what we're doing at the institute, but even particularly with From This Place, like how oral testimony has played such a role in your work to this point, and how what you want to do with it now can continue this.
Thank you. I love that question. Well, I think I've said this before, but not in this context. The Institute of Public Scholarship was a dream even when I was at FIRE,
Mm.
FIRE Historical and Cultural Arts Collaborative that I co-founded with Denise Miller, and was there for 10 years. Even, sitting at that desk, I loved everything I did. It's like one of the best things I've done with my life.
Mm.
But that piece, that scholarship piece, that the research, the having a theory and testing it out, that taking these big questions, like the big questions we have in humanities, or the big questions we have in the sciences or the arts even, understanding that there's a whole culture of saying that the only place you can answer those questions in the academy. The only place you can answer those questions are with a team of other scholars, or even the solo scholar, going into the archives, and which I've been all of those
Yes.
things. But what I saw in academia is people going and kind of extracting knowledge from our communities, and then taking it back, claiming it as their own, getting tenure or not getting tenure.
Yeah, fighting for it.
They were using it to like build their career.
Yep.
It then none of the benefits were coming back to the community.
Yep.
Right. Somebody's got a job and some insurance, but that community they went into for 5 weeks, a semester maybe, don't ever see these people again. And I felt that, and I still feel that that's like fundamentally wrong, and that we still have a lot of academics, building their careers on the backs of people who are subjects, subjects in an interview, subjects in a research project. And so I fundamentally believe that is like the wrong way to go.
Yeah.
And that the answers are largely in our community. That the people that are experiencing housing insecurity are the ones that are going to give us the solutions.
Yep.
Right. The people who are dealing with polluted air, poor air quality, they're the people that are going to tell us. They may not have all of the solutions, but they're going to give us all the evidence that we need to help co-create the solutions. Right.
Together.
And they do know the solutions. They're like, this shit need to stop.
Stop putting that in the air.
Stop.
Maybe
stop
then I can breathe.
Right. Stop doing that. They may not know the technology how to do it, but they know it needs to stop.
Yep.
And so the Institute of Public Scholarship is really intended to validate the vast knowledge that we have in our community. And so like when you talked about from this place, oral testimony, I've been doing oral testimony from the beginning.
Yeah.
From the very beginning. Sometimes I wasn't early on, I wasn't collecting all the interviews myself. I was looking at the WPA narratives and looking at people's voices. But early in grad school, I learned that the most important evidence, so to speak, was going to come from the people, the people that were the agricultural extension agents, the people who were the farmers in Louisiana, the people who, knew about Zora Neale Hurston, the people who knew Hurston, and that's the power.
Right.
And so that's really when the Institute of Public Scholarship started to it was a seed, right? Because I was doing public scholarship, and this sounds like arrogant, but before most people were doing it,
It's the fact, because those same people writing papers for each other, that community that they're working so hard to be tenured in, don't love them back either, really. It's just, where's your next book? What's the next thing you're doing? And so making scholarship public has another tinge and has, again, implications for the community that the establishment doesn't necessarily benefit from. And so fundamentally, you making that happen then absolutely aligns with everything you've said. But continue.
Yes. Yes. And so the Institute is intended to do just that, is to say, okay, so what are these big questions, right? Like say, for instance, the Remembering the Block program, right? We are fundamentally interested in all the layers of story that are here, particularly as the landscape is getting ready to change. Is even changing as we speak, right? And I just found out today that the Black Arts and Cultural Center started across the street upstairs from the Kalamazoo Boxing Academy
Wow.
after the Kalamazoo Boxing Academy closed, right?
Wow.
The Douglas Community Center started down the street, right? And so this is a corridor of empowerment, right? Talking about insistence and resistance.
Here.
This is like right here.
Where we
in
stand.
These 2 blocks right here. And if we don't bring those stories up, if we don't elevate those stories, put them in people's faces, but only from the testimonies of the people who remember or who want to know, that it's going to be gone. You know? And like I said, I came back to grad school to focus on space, place, and nature. This is all about space and place and empowerment and being able to locate the places where we have built our own identity, where we have insisted on who we are and what we want for ourselves and our community, and listen to each other to be able to create that. Those are the best practices in scholarship as far as I'm concerned.
Period.
Right? Period. And so it might look like, this is just oral testimony. We're just getting these stories. Nah, we are recreating the landscape and using that as a method to stave off or slow down gentrification, to be able to make sure that we continue to have the place that our ancestors made for us. Right. And so for me, that's the real scholarship. So the people always like, are you going to write a book about it? Probably not, because it's not about the book, right? It's about the empowerment that we create in our community to hold on to these places, to hold on to these memories. And so as much as it's public scholars, it's also activism scholarship. It's like applied history.
Good.
It's applied humanities. It's applied arts. It's applied sciences. And so it's like being informed, by the discourse, when the discourse is interesting, because quite often they're missing the mark.
Again, they just on that hamster wheel, just trying to.
You got a job talking about this stuff,
man.
But we're doing the work that theorists in academia posit as a solution. I think about Scholar Green, Micah Green, our wellness director, who is doing a great program in public health at the University of Michigan. And at least 5 times a semester, she's like, Dr. Johnson, everything that they're talking about, we're already doing it. It's like, yes, that's true.
Yes.
Because it's not like we're not distant from the discourse, right? But we are shaping the discourse. We're leading the discourse in academia. The work that you're doing with Sounds of Our Stories, right? That's cutting edge leading work, right? That 10 years from now, people gonna be on your nerves because they're like, oh, I discovered this, huh? Act like it's brand new.
I did that in 2025, Hope.
So welcome to the hindsight movement, because people are gonna be on it years from now when you already had that vision and already did that work. And so that's and I'm okay with that now, right? It used to irritate me because I was like, oh, you didn't want to talk about, the animal rights before that, and how we construct the animal.
Back then, they didn't want me,
right,
but now,
now you want to
they
talk
all
about
over
it.
Yeah.
You didn't want to talk about play and that, how play is liberatory for, especially for Black and brown people.
And
now you
look.
So I've passed my bitter era, and because of what we're doing is so beautiful,
right?
And so impactful, and people are coming in the door, more and more people coming in the door all the time, saying, "This is what I've been looking for," right? And they're looking for a place where their stories are validated. They're looking for a place that they feel safe. They're looking for a place where they can show up and write, and have quality people give them feedback about their work, right?
Yes.
So it's not just there's this level of engagement that is possible here is we co-create together,
Mm.
right? And it's not some kind of like top-down academic telling people. It's like, here's the question.
Yeah.
How are we all going to answer it? And I think that's the beauty of public scholarship. And what I'll probably do in the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Because it's so satisfying, and to create stages and places, you know, for people to be their full selves. I've
Yeah.
got the show with Quincy on Friday.
Man.
To bring talent together and to create the opportunity for talent to come together.
Yep.
To create something that was transformative for everybody in this room. And then they can people can then see themselves. Okay, like, what do I want for myself?
Yep. Yep.
And to recognize that that's a healing. So
Mhm.
I guess the last thing I will say is, our particular focus on wellness at the Institute is so critical in these conversations about scholarship, because there aren't that many fields where we centralize wellness, right? Unless we're like studying it.
Yeah.
And for us,
In and of itself, it's focus. Otherwise, it's like secondary or just in word and not in action.
Exactly. And so to continue to create environments for people to try out different wellness modalities that could just be a show, a music show.
Yep.
That's, for me, that's
come and enjoy some art.
Exactly.
Our neurology changes when we see art. It's proven.
Yep. So it's a beautiful thing. We have the most incredible team of people I've ever worked with in my life, and I've worked with some really great people. But to have the synergy that this team has with passion and vision and hard work. We work hard. We work real hard. But we love hard too. And we love hard, and we love softly too. It's not just hard love. It's like, we
gentle.
We are,
nice
we,
touches.
Right. We allow gentleness, and in this time we need that even more than we ever did. I don't know, maybe we ever did. That might just be hyperbole, but we really need it.
We need it always.
We've always been needing it, right?
And we're going to keep needing it. 10 more years, and we some more gentleness and love, okay? Please.
And so I know you get. So one other thing I want to just talk about real quickly is the Audacity project of envisioning a Black utopia. And that is, very much rooted in like scholarly questions of how people envision their present, their past, and their future, and then what happens as a result of that, right? So we all know in psychology and sociology and anthropology that everything is a reflection of what we know or think we know, and then create as a result of it. The Audacity Project takes that to heart and understands that we, as Black people, especially today in this moment, need to see ourselves in the future, right? And we have a vast amount of knowledge, that has become scholarship, some that hasn't, to build this present of healing and wellness and hope, right? Hope when hope doesn't look like very hopeful. And so the Audacity Project is an attempt to, or not even just an attempt, but an actualizing us understanding better our future, having this team of people that are coming on Thursday to talk about Black resorts, so that we can take that history and mobilize it and say, this is what's possible. This is what people are doing with a lot less resources than we had. Or in some cases, maybe more resources, because they were coming out of like vibrant Black communities that had businesses.
They had some.
They did have some advantages.
They had some.
They did. But unless we know what those mechanisms were for people to be able to create these communities, then we're going to have to recreate stuff by ourselves, right? We'll still come up with the solutions, right? But why, when we have
but now we're back in the silos.
When we have a history that can teach us how, when, where, who of building the utopia that we've been trying to build for hundreds of years. And so all questions of scholarship, history. That's why I love history.
Yeah.
Not because it's like, oh, this happened and then this happened, because all the tools are in there.
That tells you what to do moving forward.
And then gives us the ingredients to build new tools if we need them. But
Yep.
a lot of those old tools,
If it ain't broke.
that's right.
But some of it is.
Some of it's very broke.
And so both and.
Capitalism. But there's some of this
For one. Imperialism, I tell you. Not sustainable. Yeah, but how we navigate them with that critical lens and with the honor of what was, informing what can be.
Absolutely.
That's what we need. Well, good. Well, I can't wait to do this again.
Well, thank you so much for
Yay.
wanting to have this conversation and facilitating it, and visioning it and remembering how important it is for people to hear this.
Yeah. I think since this is our first one, this just came to me that we should end on a question. In light of what we talked about, in light of what the Institute is about, asking these big questions and applying them in the work we do, a big question I have in light of this conversation is, how do we celebrate Juneteenth now that we know what we know? That can be for the listeners to decide. That can be for us to reflect on. But how do we celebrate Juneteenth now?
Yep. Find the way. The ways.
Yep. That's right. Yeah.
Love
Well,
that.
thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Well, thank you, Scholar Ivey.
I love you.
I love you so much.
The Institute Speaks is a podcast produced by Sounds of Our Stories under the Institute of Public Scholarship. The theme song and this episode were recorded and mixed by Jessica Ivey.